What if I told you that a single moment of cruelty in a school cafeteria would spark a movement that reached millions of people around the world? What if that moment involved a 12-year-old black boy, a homemade lunch that represented generations of love, and a room full of children who had been taught to see difference as something to mock rather than celebrate? This is the story of Marcus Williams, a seventh grader from Columbus, Ohio, whose quiet dignity in the face of racist humiliation would eventually lead to one of the most powerful televised responses to childhood discrimination ever recorded. It's a story that begins with laughter, cruel, cutting laughter that echoed through a middle school cafeteria on an ordinary Tuesday in March 2019. But it's also a story about how that same laughter would be transformed into something far more powerful, a voice that would educate, inspire, and change hearts across the nation. Marcus Williams didn't set out to become a symbol of resilience. He didn't wake up that morning planning to deliver a speech that would be viewed by over 10 million people, or to become the youngest recipient of the NAACP's Youth Courage Award. He just wanted to eat his lunch in peace, enjoy the meal his grandmother had prepared with love, and get through another day at Jefferson Middle School. But sometimes, the most ordinary moments become extraordinary, not because of what we plan, but because of how we choose to respond when the world shows us its ugliest face. Marcus Williams' response to racism would prove that the most powerful revolutions often begin not with grand gestures, but with a young person's decision to stand up and speak their truth. This is his story, a story of pain transformed into purpose, of humiliation transformed into hope, and of one boy's lunch that became a lesson for the world. Marcus Williams was born in 2006 in Columbus, Ohio, to parents who understood the weight of raising a black child in America. His father, David Williams, was a mechanic who had grown up during the tail end of the civil rights movement, and his mother, Carmen Williams, was a nurse who had experienced her own share of workplace discrimination. They raised Marcus and his younger sister Zara with a deep understanding of their heritage and an unshakable belief in their own worth. The Williams family lived in a modest, two-story house in the Hilltop neighborhood, a predominantly black community that had been fighting against disinvestment for decades. Despite the challenges their neighborhood faced, the Williams home was filled with love, laughter, and the rich aromas of Caribbean cooking, a legacy from Marcus's grandmother, Abuela Rosa, who had immigrated from Dominican Republic in the 1970s. Abuela Rosa was the heart of the Williams household. Every morning before school, she would wake up at 5 a.m. to prepare fresh lunches for Marcus and Zara. Her hands, weathered by decades of hard work, would carefully fold tender pork into homemade tortillas, pack containers of fragrant rice and beans, and wrap slices of sweet plantain in aluminum foil. For Abuela Rosa, food was love made tangible. Each meal was a connection to her homeland and a way of ensuring her grandchildren carried their culture with pride. "Meow," she would tell Marcus as she packed his lunch, "when you eat this food, you taste the hands of all the women who came before us. You taste our history, our strength, our love. Never let anyone make you ashamed of who you are or where you come from." Marcus attended Jefferson Middle School, a public school that served a diverse population, but was divided by invisible lines of race and class. The school district had been implementing desegregation policies since the 1970s, busing students from different neighborhoods to promote integration. But as research shows, true integration involves more than just putting children of different races in the same building. It requires addressing the deeper systemic inequalities that shape students' experiences. According to data from Feeding America, food insecurity affects black children at disproportionate rates, with nearly 1 in 3 black children living without reliable access to food. At Jefferson Middle School, 68% of students qualified for free or reduced price lunch, but the stigma surrounding school meal programs meant that many students, particularly students of color, faced discrimination and judgment around their food choices. The racial climate at Jefferson Middle School in 2019 reflected broader national tensions. The Trump presidency had emboldened more explicit expressions of racism, and incidents of hate speech and discriminatory behavior were increasing in schools across the country. Teachers and administrators, many of whom were well-meaning but lacked training in addressing racial bias, often failed to recognize or respond appropriately to racist incidents. Marcus was a quiet, thoughtful child who loved reading science fiction, novels, and playing chess with his grandfather. He was the type of student who preferred to observe rather than be the center of attention, but his teachers recognized his sharp intellect and natural leadership abilities. He maintained good grades, participated in the school's debate club, and had dreams of becoming an engineer like his hero, George Washington Carver. But like many black children, Marcus navigated daily microaggressions and incidents of racism that were often dismissed by adults as kids being kids. Students would touch his hair without permission, make comments about his clothing, or ask invasive questions about his family's economic status. The cumulative effect of these experiences was exhausting, creating what researchers call racial battle fatigue, the psychological and physiological symptoms that result from constantly facing racial microaggressions. Marcus's parents had prepared him as best they could for these challenges. They had taught him about his history, from the brilliance of ancient African civilizations to the courage of civil rights leaders. They had instilled in him a sense of pride in his identity, and the knowledge that his worth was not determined by others' opinions. But no amount of preparation could have readied him for what would happen on March 12, 2019, when his quiet strength would be tested in the most public and humiliating way possible. The stage was set for a confrontation that would force an entire community to reckon with its biases and push a 12-year-old boy to find a voice he didn't know he had. March 12, 2019, started like any other day at Jefferson Middle School. Marcus Williams arrived early, as was his habit, and spent the morning quietly moving through his classes. His backpack held the usual supplies, textbooks, notebooks, and the carefully packed lunch his grandmother had prepared before dawn. That morning, Abuela Rosa had made something special: pernil, slow-roasted pork, yellow rice with sofrito, sweet plantains, and homemade flan for dessert. It was the same meal she had made for her own children decades earlier, passed down through generations of Dominican women who understood that food was both sustenance and cultural identity. When lunch period arrived at 12:15 p.m., Marcus made his way to the cafeteria with his friend Jamal, a black student who had been his friend since elementary school. The Jefferson Middle School cafeteria was a typical institutional space: long tables, fluorescent lighting, and the constant hum of 400 preteens talking, laughing, and navigating the complex social hierarchies of middle school. Marcus and Jamal found seats at their usual table near the back of the cafeteria, away from the more popular students who clustered near the front. Marcus unpacked his lunch carefully, placing each container on the table with the same care his grandmother had used to pack it. The aroma of the seasoned pork and fragrant rice immediately filled the air around their table. It was then that the comments started. "Oh my God, what is that smell?" said Aiden Cooper, a white seventh grader who sat at the table behind Marcus. Aiden was the type of student who had never wanted for anything his designer clothing, expensive sneakers, and latest iPhone marked him as one of the more privileged students at Jefferson. His comment was loud enough to draw attention from surrounding tables. "It's like really gross," added Madison Price, Aiden's girlfriend, wrinkling her nose in exaggerated disgust. Madison's perfectly straightened blonde hair and Lululemon jacket marked her as part of the school's social elite. "Is that even food?" More students began to turn and stare. Marcus felt his face growing hot as he recognized the familiar pattern of unwanted attention. He tried to continue eating, hoping the moment would pass, but the comments were getting louder and more cruel. "That looks like dog food," said Tyler Roberts, another white student who had joined the growing audience. "Why would anyone eat that? Maybe it's some kind of weird foreign food," Madison said, loud enough for most of the cafeteria to hear. "My mom says some cultures eat really strange things." The word foreign hit Marcus like a physical blow. This was the food of his heritage, the recipes his grandmother had carried from her homeland, the flavors that connected him to generations of his family. But in the mouths of these students, his culture was being reduced to something strange. Other, less than Dot Jamal leaned over and whispered, "Just ignore them, man. They're being stupid." But the comments continued to escalate. What had started as whispered remarks had become a public spectacle, with more and more students turning to stare at Marcus's lunch. Some were taking pictures with their phones. Others were laughing and pointing. The cafeteria supervisor, Mrs. Henderson, was at the other end of the room, dealing with a food fight, and seemed oblivious to what was happening. "I bet he can't even afford real food," Aiden said, his voice carrying across multiple tables. "That's why he brings that weird stuff from home." The comment about affording real food struck at the heart of a deeper racism that pervaded American society. The idea that foods from other cultures were somehow less legitimate, less valuable, less American than the processed food served in the school cafeteria or packed in lunchboxes by white families. "At least the school lunch looks normal," Madison added, pointing to her tray of chicken nuggets and French fries. "I don't know how he can eat that ... stuff." Marcus felt something breaking inside him. This wasn't just about his lunch, it about his grandmother's love, his family's history, his culture's worth. It was about every time he had been made to feel different, wrong, less than because of the color of his skin or the culture of his family. The tipping point came when Tyler Roberts, emboldened by the laughter of his peers, stood up and said in a mock accent, "Maybe he should go back to where that food comes from. This is America. We eat American food here." The cafeteria fell silent. Even the students who had been laughing seemed to realize that Tyler had crossed the line from cruel teasing into overt racism. But the damage was done. Every eye in the cafeteria was on Marcus Williams, who sat frozen with a forkful of his grandmother's rice halfway to his mouth. Marcus felt the familiar sting of tears behind his eyes. But something else was rising in his chest. Anger, yes, but also a clarity that surprised him. He thought about his grandmother's hands preparing his lunch in the dark morning hours. He thought about his parents' stories of facing discrimination with dignity. He thought about all the lessons about pride and heritage that his family had tried to teach him. Slowly, Marcus put down his fork and stood up. The cafeteria was so quiet that students from across the room had stopped eating to watch what would happen next. Marcus looked directly at Tyler Roberts, then at Madison and Aiden, then at the crowd of students who had been laughing at his expense. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but steady. "This food was made by my grandmother, who came to this country with nothing but recipes passed down from her mother and her mother's mother. Every ingredient was chosen with love. Every flavor tells a story of where my family comes from and who we are. If you think that's funny, then you don't understand what love looks like." He paused, picked up a forkful of the pearl, and took a deliberate bite. "This is the best food in this cafeteria because it was made with the best ingredient, love for family, and I'm proud of every single bite." With that, Marcus sat back down and continued eating his lunch, his hands no longer shaking. The cafeteria remained silent for several long moments before conversation slowly resumed. But something had shifted. The students who had been laughing were now uncomfortable, unsure of how to respond to Marcus's quiet dignity. What none of them knew was that Zoe Martinez, An eighth grader with a passion for journalism had recorded the entire exchange on her phone. That video, uploaded to social media that evening, would change everything. The video of Marcus Williams defending his lunch spread across social media platforms with the speed and intensity of wildfire. Within 24 hours, it had been shared over 50,000 times on Twitter, viewed hundreds of thousands of times on TikTok, and had made its way to Facebook groups dedicated to anti-racism and education reform. The hashtag Proud of My Lunch began trending as people from around the world shared photos of their own cultural foods and stories of discrimination they had faced. But for Marcus, the viral attention was overwhelming and at times re-traumatizing. While many of the comments and messages were supportive, others were deeply racist and threatening. Internet trolls found his social media accounts and flooded them with hateful messages. Some comments were so vile that his parents were forced to contact local police and school administrators. "I just wanted to eat my lunch," Marcus told his parents on the evening after the video went viral. "I didn't want to be famous. I didn't want all these strangers talking about me." His father, David, sat on the edge of Marcus's bed and looked at his son with a mixture of pride and concern. "Son, sometimes life puts us in positions we didn't choose. But what matters is how we respond to those positions. You showed grace under pressure, and that's something to be proud of." His mother, Carmen, was more focused on the practical concerns. She had already missed work to field calls from news outlets, had contacted the school demanding action against the students who had bullied Marcus, and was working with the family's church to provide emotional support for her son. Abuela Rosa, however, had a different perspective. When she saw the video, she wept not from sadness, but from pride. "Mio," she told Marcus, "you defended our family, our culture, our love. You did what your ancestors would have done. You stood up with dignity." At Jefferson Middle School, the administration was scrambling to respond to the national attention the incident had generated. Principal Janet Morrison, a white woman who had been leading the school for 5 years, called an emergency meeting with the district's diversity and inclusion coordinator. They were facing intense pressure from both the community and the media to address what was clearly a racially motivated incident. The students involved in bullying Marcus faced different consequences. Tyler Roberts, whose "Go Back Where You Came From" comment had been the most explicitly racist, was suspended for 3 days. Madison Price and Aiden Cooper received 1-day suspensions and were required to attend sensitivity training. Many in the community felt these consequences were insufficient, given the severity of the racist harassment. Dr. Kaisha Washington, a black clinical psychologist who specialized in racial trauma, was brought in to work with Marcus and other students who had been affected by the incident. In her sessions with Marcus, she helped him understand that his response to the bullying had been both brave and healthy. "You didn't respond with anger or violence," Dr. Washington explained. "You responded with dignity and truth. That takes incredible strength, especially for someone your age. But it's also important to acknowledge that you shouldn't have had to defend yourself at all. The burden of addressing racism should never fall on the children who experience it." Research supports Dr. Washington's approach. Studies show that when children of color are forced to constantly defend themselves against racist attacks, it can lead to chronic stress, anxiety, and depression. The psychological toll of racism on children is well documented, with black children showing higher rates of trauma-related symptoms even at young ages. Meanwhile, the broader Jefferson Middle School community was being forced to confront uncomfortable truths about race and privilege. The Parent-Teacher Association held emergency meetings to discuss how to address racism in the school. Some parents, particularly white parents, were defensive and argued that the incident had been blown out of proportion. "Kids say mean things all the time," argued Jennifer Cooper, Aiden's mother, during one particularly heated PTA meeting. "I don't think this was about race. I think it was just typical middle school teasing." But other parents, led by Marcus's mother Carmen and several other parents of color, pushed back against this narrative. "When children tell another child to go back where they came from, that's not teasing," Carmen said, her voice steady but firm. "That's racism. And if we don't call it what it is, we're failing all of our children." The incident also sparked broader conversations about food insecurity and cultural sensitivity in schools. Advocates pointed out that lunch shaming disproportionately affects children of color and children from low-income families. According to research from Feeding America, children who experience lunch shaming often skip meals entirely rather than face humiliation, leading to poor academic performance and health outcomes. Marcus found unexpected support from other students who had experienced similar incidents. A group of students of color at Jefferson Middle School formed an unofficial support group, sharing their own stories of microaggressions and discrimination. They called themselves the Cultural Pride Club and began meeting weekly to discuss their experiences and plan responses to racism in their school. The club's faculty sponsor was Ms. Rodriguez, a Latina English teacher who had witnessed Marcus's dignity in the cafeteria and felt compelled to act. "What Marcus did was remarkable," she told the group during one of their meetings. "He showed us that we can respond to hatred with truth, to ignorance with education, and to cruelty with grace." But perhaps the most significant development came when Marcus received an unexpected phone call. Dr. Angela Davis, the renowned civil rights activist and scholar, had seen the video and wanted to speak with him personally. "Young man," Dr. Davis said during their video call, "you demonstrated something that seasoned activists spend years learning: how to speak truth to power with dignity. You have a gift, and I believe you have something important to say to the world." It was Dr. Davis who would connect Marcus with the opportunity that would change his life: a chance to speak at the National Youth Leadership Summit, an event that would be broadcast live on major news networks. For the first time since the incident, Marcus felt excited rather than overwhelmed by the attention his story had generated. He had found his voice, and he was ready to use it. 3 months after the cafeteria incident, Marcus Williams stood backstage at the National Youth Leadership Summit in Washington, D.C., his hands slightly trembling as he reviewed his speech notes one final time. The auditorium beyond the curtain held 2,000 young people from across the country, along with educators, activists, and leaders. More importantly, the event was being broadcast live on CNN, MSNBC, and streaming on multiple platforms and audience that would reach millions. Dr. Angela Davis stood beside him, offering quiet encouragement. "Remember, Marcus," she said, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder, "you're not just speaking for yourself. You're speaking for every child who has ever been made to feel ashamed of who they are. But most importantly, you're speaking your truth." Marcus nodded, thinking about the journey that had brought him to this moment. The past 3 months had been transformative. The Cultural Pride Club at Jefferson Middle School had grown to include over 100 students from diverse backgrounds. The school district had implemented new anti-bullying policies, specifically addressing racist harassment. And Marcus himself had become something he never expected to be: an advocate. The moderator's voice echoed through the auditorium. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Marcus Williams, a 13-year-old student from Columbus, Ohio, whose response to racism in his school cafeteria inspired millions around the world." As Marcus walked onto the stage, the applause was thunderous. He looked out at the sea of young faces: black, white, Latino, Asian, Native American, faces that reflected the beautiful diversity of America. For a moment, he thought about that day in the cafeteria when he had felt so alone, so humiliated. Now, he felt the power of community, of shared purpose. of truth waiting to be spoken. He adjusted the microphone and began to speak, his voice clear and strong. 3 months ago, I was just a kid who wanted to eat his lunch in peace. I wasn't trying to make a statement or start a movement. I was just trying to enjoy the food my grandmother made for me with love pernel, yellow rice, sweet plantains, and flan that she had been perfecting since she was a little girl in the Dominican Republic. The audience was completely silent, hanging on his every word. But when other students laughed at my food, when they called it weird and foreign, when they told me to go back where I came from, they weren't just attacking my lunch. They were attacking my grandmother's love. They were attacking my family's history. They were attacking me. Marcus paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the audience. I want to talk to you today about something that adults call microaggressions, but I call everyday racism. It's when people touch your hair without asking. It's when they assume you're poor because you don't look like them. It's when they act like your culture is strange or wrong instead of different and beautiful. It's when they make you feel like you have to hide who you are to fit in. He looked directly into the camera, knowing that millions of people were watching. But here's what I learned that day in my cafeteria. I don't have to hide anymore. None of us do. Our differences aren't something to be ashamed of. They're our superpowers. My grandmother's recipes connect me to generations of strong Dominican women. My friend Jamal's family traditions connect him to the rich history of American culture. My friend Sarah's Jewish holidays connect her to thousands of years of tradition and resilience. The applause began to build, but Marcus raised his hand gently, indicating he wasn't finished. I want to challenge everyone watching this, kids and adults, to do 3 things. First, learn about cultures different from your own, not to judge them, but to celebrate them. Ask questions from curiosity, not mockery. Second, when you see someone being treated differently because of their race, their religion, their culture, their family's income, speak up. Don't be a bystander. Be an upstander. And third, be proud of who you are. Don't let anyone make you feel ashamed of your family, your food, your traditions, your skin, your story. Marcus's voice grew stronger as he approached his conclusion. That day in my cafeteria, I had a choice. I could have been silent. I could have thrown away my lunch and tried to blend in. But instead, I chose to speak my truth. I chose to honor my grandmother's love. I chose to be proud of who I am. And that choice changed my life. He held up a small container, the same type his grandmother used to pack his lunch. This is my lunch container. It's traveled with me to this stage today. Inside, I have a small portion of my grandmother's rice, the same rice those kids laughed at 3 months ago. And you know what? It still tastes like love. It still tastes like pride. It still tastes like home. The standing ovation that followed lasted for nearly 5 minutes. But more important than the applause were the tears Marcus could see in the audience. Tears of recognition, of healing, of hope. Marcus Williams had found his voice, and the world was listening. The impact of Marcus Williams' speech was immediate and far-reaching. Within hours, clips of his address had been viewed over 2 million times across social media platforms. Hashtag #LunchLove began trending globally as people shared photos of their cultural foods and stories of overcoming discrimination. Major news outlets featured Marcus on their programs, and his message of cultural pride and dignified resistance resonated with audiences far beyond his original demographic. More importantly, Marcus's words sparked concrete changes in schools across the country. The Jefferson Middle School District implemented comprehensive anti-racism training for all staff members and created a cultural celebration month where students were encouraged to share their heritage through food, music, and storytelling. The lunch program was redesigned to include foods from various cultures, and lunch shaming policies were strengthened with real consequences for discriminatory behavior. The 3 students who had originally bullied Marcus faced social consequences as well as official ones. Tyler Roberts, whose racist comments had been the most egregious, was required to complete 40 hours of community service at a local immigrant services center and write a public apology that was published in the school newspaper. While some critics argued that the consequences were still insufficient, Tyler's experience working with immigrant families appeared to genuinely change his perspective. "I didn't realize how my words affected people," Tyler wrote in his apology letter. "Working with families at the center, hearing their stories, seeing how hard they work, it made me understand that what I said was really hurtful and wrong. I want to do better." Madison Price and Aidan Cooper also completed community service and diversity training. More significantly, Madison became one of the most active members of Jefferson Middle School's new Diversity and Inclusion Committee, working to create programs that celebrated cultural differences rather than mocking them. For Marcus himself, the months following his speech were transformative but challenging. The attention brought opportunities, invitations to speak at schools and conferences, scholarship offers for high school, and even interest from literary agents who wanted to help him write a book about his experiences. But it also brought continued harassment from internet trolls and the pressure of being viewed as a spokesperson for all young people facing racism. Dr. Kaisha Washington continued working with Marcus to help him process the complex emotions that came with his newfound platform. "It's important to remember that you're still a child," she reminded him during one of their sessions. "You don't have to carry the burden of solving racism. You just have to be authentic to your own experience." Marcus's family remained his anchor throughout the experience. Abuela Rosa became something of a local celebrity herself, with cooking shows reaching out to feature her recipes. She remained focused on her grandson's well-being, ensuring that he stayed grounded despite the attention. "Mio is still the same boy who helps me in the kitchen every Sunday," she told a reporter from the Columbus Dispatch. "Fame doesn't change who you are inside. His heart is still good, still kind. That's what matters." By the end of his 7th grade year, Marcus had received the NAACP Youth Courage Award, been featured in Time magazine's Most Influential Teens list, and had been invited to speak at the United Nations International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. But perhaps more meaningfully, he had helped create a shift in his own school community that made it safer and more welcoming for all students. The Cultural Pride Club had grown to include students from over 20 different cultural backgrounds, and their monthly cultural food festivals had become one of the most popular events at Jefferson Middle School. Students who had never interacted before were sharing recipes, learning about each other's traditions, and building friendships across racial and cultural lines. Marcus's impact extended beyond his school as well. The lunch love movement he had inadvertently started led to policy changes in school districts across the country. Anti-lunch shaming legislation was passed in 4 additional states, and the federal school nutrition program began incorporating more diverse food options to reflect the cultural backgrounds of American students. Perhaps most importantly, Marcus had proven that young people could be powerful agents of change. His dignified response to racism had shown that strength didn't require anger, that education could be more powerful than retaliation, and that love, even love packed in a lunch container, could overcome hatred. As Marcus entered 8th grade, he carried with him not just his grandmother's lunch, but the knowledge that his voice mattered, his culture was beautiful, and his story could help heal a divided world. The story of Marcus Williams reminds us that the most powerful responses to hatred often come not from grand gestures, but from quiet dignity in the face of cruelty. A 12-year-old boy's decision to defend his grandmother's cooking became a masterclass in grace under pressure, showing the world that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, "I am proud of who I am." Marcus's journey illustrates several crucial truths about racism and resistance in America. First, that racism isn't always the dramatic incidents we see in news headlines. It's also the daily microaggressions that tell children their cultures are strange, their families are wrong, their very existence is somehow less valuable. Second, that children are often wiser than adults give them credit for, possessing an innate sense of justice that can cut through years of learned prejudice. And third, that change doesn't require perfection. It requires courage. The lunch that was mocked in a middle school cafeteria became a symbol of cultural pride for millions of people. The boy who just wanted to eat in peace became a voice for all those who had been silenced by shame. The grandmother's recipes that were dismissed as weird became a bridge connecting people across racial and cultural divides. But perhaps most importantly, Marcus Williams' story shows us that every person, no matter how young, no matter how small their voice may seem, has the power to change the world. He didn't set out to become an activist or a symbol. He just decided that he would not be ashamed of who he was. Today, as racism continues to divide communities and break hearts, we need more Marcus Williams, more young people willing to speak truth with love, more individuals ready to stand up for their culture and their families, more voices raised not in anger but in dignity. The question isn't whether you're old enough or important enough to make a difference. The question is, when faced with your moment of choice, will you have the courage to say, like Marcus did, "I am proud of who I am"? Your lunch, your culture, your story, they all matter. And the world is waiting to hear your voice.